Hello again, my adventuring companions. It is I, Noir Reservoir. And I have now realised that I've been gone for quite some time, huh? In fact, I've seen a lot of people getting quite concerned when I stopped making videos for the past 10 months. I've even had people ask for me to come back, so I'm going to kick off this video with an apology for being gone for so long. Now, just for some reassurance for you all, I'd like to go on the record and say that no, I in fact did not die. But you know who might?
A Sierra video game protagonist.
In light of my sudden death and resurrection, I opted to return back into the fray with a beloved franchise. Now, most of you love the Sierra games that I've played that like to torment me, from trying to overcome notoriously unfair dead ends to facing off against my true nemesis, stairs. And what better game to go back to than one of their most beloved adventure game IPs? An adventure game fit for a king, if you will. King's Quest. At this point, we've already completed our quest for the crown in 1984's King's Quest 1. And we also helped our beloved Leisure Suit Graham score by rescuing a damsel to become his beloved queen. So, it only makes sense that we finally buckle down and tackle King's Quest 3, a game that is often considered as the most difficult in the series. So let's dive in as we fall victim to several pitfalls such as wily wizards, ferocious felines, and other incredibly cheap and frustrating grisly ends that we've come to love so much. After the success of the previous two entries in the series, King's Quest 1 Quest for the Crown and King's Quest 2 Romancing the Throne, Roberta Williams and her team once more went to work forging yet another beloved adventure game. One that would charm many people and yet have a bit of a bite to it. Many of the Sierra alumni who would become prominent members of the development team for future games were involved with production of King's Quest 3. Roberta once again took lead as the designer of the game, while also writing the game alongside Annette Childs. Annette Childs is a member of Sierra who would be credited with writing several of their IPs, including King's Quest 2 and King's Quest 3, although this is the final game she would be credited for writing. Alongside them, both Doug McNeil and Mark Crow would return from King's Quest 2 as the artist for the third game. Doug McNeil, who worked on several Sierra properties prior to this and worked as one of the artists for the previous two games in the series, would eventually step away from the graphic design of the video games and instead create and design the 1988 Sierra game Gold Rush. Mark Crow, meanwhile, worked on many of Sierra's other properties, including the second King's Quest game, and would later famously form a duo with Scott Murphy, one of the programmers of King's Quest 2, with the two being referred to as the two guys from Andromeda. The duo would become very well known for creating another of Sierra's famous IPs, Space Quest, beginning with Space Quest 1, The Sarian Encounter, which was released just a month prior to King's Quest 3. However, none of the programmers for King's Quest 1 or 2 would return for 3, but instead it saw King's Quest 2's composer, Al Lowe, move into a programming role for King's Quest 3 alongside Bob Heitman and Bob Kernigan. Al Lowe would famously create one of Sierra's other prominent IPs, Leisure Suit Larry, with the first game in the series releasing the following year after King's Quest 3, Leisure Suit Larry and the Land of the Lounge Lizards. And rather than compose the soundtrack for the third game, Al's wife Margaret Lowe would take over that area. Bob Eric Heitman would also be involved in many of Sierra's catalogues of games, while Bob Kernigan seems to have disappeared after King's Quest 3. I couldn't find any other further information on him, and it looks like this would be the only game Bob would create. Perhaps he was kidnapped by a wizard? Who knows? After a lot of effort from the team working on the latest in the series, the world would finally bear witness to the fruit of their labour in November 1986. King's Quest 3 to air is Human, releasing on the Apple II and on MS-DOS. But while previous games would feature our beloved monarch of Daventry, King Graham, the third game would instead shift the focus. In fact, no longer would we be king or a noble knight. We would instead take on the role of a young man known as Gwydion, meaning that despite what the title suggests, King's Quest III begins with neither a quest fit for a king nor a quest to help aid the king. Instead, the story would move across the world to a new location, where the player instead takes the role of poorly Gwydion as he toils away in servitude to his master, a powerful wizard who will cause great harm to unruly little boys if they don't do as they're told. It's a decision that apparently rattled a few fans. In fact, in the King's Quest Collection manual, the writer recalls that the decision to replace Gwydion with King Graham was met with a very vocal protest from fans, because after all, it couldn't really be a King's Quest game now, could it? The part of me wondered if that was even that big of a deal, but then I remembered the outcry when Metal Gear Solid 2 came out, and then suddenly I began to realise the extent of how angry these people could be. Soundingly, not very much backstory is given in the game before beginning, and instead any semblance of backstory needs to be gleaned from the King's Quest III manual, but even then, no mention is even made of King Graham or the lands of Daventry. Instead, the manual details the settings of the third game, the lands of Ludor, which sounds suspiciously like a raunchy leather suit Larry setting. In the lands, a powerful wizard known as Manannan lived alongside his apprentice, although Manannan became greatly infuriated at the sight of his apprentice casting magic when he became 18 years old. Apparently, to cast magic, you need to pass the PEGI 18 mark. In a fit of rage, Manannan kills the young man and instead chooses to start kidnapping young children, vowing never to allow them to grow up and plotting to kill them as soon as they reach 18 years old. For many cycles, this continued until one day Manannan found his latest servant to clean up after him, young Gwydion. This is where our tale begins, as Gwydion toils away outside, feeding the chickens for his master. For the past 17 years, Gwydion has grown up in what can loosely be called the care of Manannan for all of his young life, knowing only his role as a captive servant forced to do the bidding of the evil wizard, and desiring nothing more than to be free. But alas, Manannan is very insistent on keeping him in the house to complete whatever trifle matters the wizard can concoct, showing up randomly to yell at him for not tidying things such as the floor. The inside of Manannan's house is going to become very well known with the player at the start of the game, as they need to perform chores to satisfy their wizardly captor. Periodically, Manannan will appear in a very extra fashion and demand that Gwydion complete a task in a timely manner. This can range from cleaning his study to feeding his chicken. Although sometimes the wizard will just show up and be like, clean my duty, and teleports away, leaving Gwydion to clean up after him. Uh-oh, stinky. As you can imagine, it can't go on like this. Gwydion needs to escape from a pretty poopy lifestyle. Literally. If Gwydion dares to take too long in performing his demands, Manannan gets really Madannan. Really? And will punish the poor servant for his insubordination, and if Gwydion rebels too much, then the wizard's already thin patience will have evaporated at this point, resulting in him killing the young man and leaving a vacancy for Manannan's personal little whipping boy open for future applicants. As a captive, Gwydion roams around the household, including the kitchen where he prepares many of the wizard's meals, and the pantry where most of the food is kept, although the selection is pretty limited. On some occasions, the wizard might make demands of Gwydion to fetch him something to eat, and the player can find several items such as bread, fruit and mutton, but apparently Manannan doesn't quite remember to get groceries often because this is all the food he has in the house, and I'll have to explain later on why this can be problematic. As well as the kitchen on the first floor, there is also the wizard's study, although the wizard is pretty adamantly against Gwydion even thinking of going in here. Who knows what kind of secrets he has lurking in here after all. On the next floor is the wizard's grand bedroom, which is resplendent, especially when compared to Gwydion's small little chambers under the stairs, but this shabby little accommodation will become of great importance in Gwydion's escape efforts. And on top of the house is Manarin's observatory, which he uses to keep his creepy wizard eyes affixed on local lands, where he no doubt keeps a tight watch on the locals to torment them. After some time, Manarin makes another sudden appearance, choosing to teleport instead of simply using the door. Upon appearing, he tells Gwydion that he's taking a journey and mysteriously teleports away. Where is he off to? Who knows, the game never actually explains what Manarin's up to in this time. For all we know, he might be going out for some enchanted goat's milk, to grab some much needed groceries, or to pick up a pack of wizardly cigarettes. But given how barren his kitchen is, I somehow doubt it. But much like a teenager whose parents are away for a weekend, we are taking full advantage of this. When Manarin leaves, this gives Gwydion a lot more freedom than normal and allows him to do things that would otherwise result in punishment or death from his master. However, the player has to ensure that they heed the amount of time they have left until the wizard comes back. The game doesn't make it very clear, but whenever the wizard leaves, it leaves the player with 25 minutes without the old man sticking his weathered wrinkly face into Gwydion's business, giving him free rein to explore everywhere in the house and even venture out into the world. But it's very important to be careful to stick to those 25 minutes. If Manarin even catches a whiff of something that stinks that isn't in his chamber pot, he'll be very quick to corner Gwydion and make him pay. But to help aid with this, the game implements a clock at the top window to help the player keep track. It's this clock that adds an element of stress to the player as they realise that time becomes a very prominent part of gameplay. With the Wizard Vamoose, it gives the player more opportunity to nosy around his personal belongings, such as in his bedroom where the player can skulk around in his wardrobe and find a magical map that allows them to teleport to anywhere they've been before. As you might have noticed, the game operates using a parser, much like its predecessors. When interacting with environments, the player needs to type in exactly what they would like to do, such as open wardrobe. However, the problem is, and with many of these games that I've often had, is that they make hotspots non-existent. In many later point-and-click adventure games, including future King's Quest games, the player would instead utilise the mouse, which would allow them to scroll across the screen, and through careful scrutinous pixel hunting, they might notice a hidden prize with their inquisitive little eyes. But for these games, precise prompts would be needed, and often it would make the game much more challenging, such as how the player is supposed to mind read the game to know that there's a key also hidden on top of the shelves, or to know to look further into the wardrobe to locate the magical map. The map is admittedly optional, and the game can be forgiven for hiding it relatively well, but the key? Well, that's a different story. The key is very important to Gwydion's quest as it unlocks a cabinet down below in the wizard's study, which in turn holds one of Manarin's prized possessions, his magic wand, which of course is something that Gwydion can make lots of mischief with. The player can also pull a lever hidden behind a book leading down below to a hidden room with many of Manarin's personal wizardly goodies, including multiple spell ingredients and a very inviting spell book, all of which will be both Gwydion's salvation and Manarin's downfall. But it isn't quite as easy as looking at the book, as haphazardly messing around with the book is likely to cause a lot of misfortune for Gwydion. But how does one use it safely? Well, by legally purchasing the game. You've likely heard of copy protection in video games before. Copy protection is the means of preventing the game illegally being distributed among people. While a lot of the world has moved on to more digital collections stored on their Steam and GOG accounts, games would often come packaged with collectibles known as feelies that you could hold in real life, often being neat little trinkets for the player such as scrolls or maps in Resort games. But eventually the developers decided they needed to try and curb people for pirating their games and began to think outside of the box. Or well, actually, it might be more accurate to say that the developers began thinking inside of the box. In some cases, some of the items that were shipped inside the game box itself would provide necessary information to progress through the game, such as the pirate wheel from The Secret of Monkey Island, or perhaps one of the most famous examples, having to read the radio frequency of the case of Metal Gear Solid 1. In King's Quest III, the game would come with a manual, which would provide some minor backstory to Manannan and his history with little boys, which, saying aloud, sounds incredibly problematic actually. But more importantly, it features a list of several spells for the player to utilise, and with it, it explains the ingredients for Gwydion to gather and the instructions on how to complete them, including incantations. If Gwydion were to attempt to craft the spell without the instruction of the manual, well, he would be in for a rough time and the player would realistically not have been able to complete it at the time, especially considering this was before the true dawn of video game walkthroughs. Now just to clarify, I don't own a physical copy of any of the King's Quest games, but please don't think I'm some common bandit pilfering from poor Sierra. Bob Kernahan's not going to suddenly appear from the shadows to exact revenge on me for stealing a game he coded 40 years ago or anything. While there is an allure for physical games, I admittedly find myself on more of the digital side of things these days. I purchased a copy of the King's Quest collection on Steam. While it robs me of having a nifty little box for my collection, at least until Limited Runs gets on that, they did see fit to attach the game's manual as PDFs for future generations to continue to enjoy. The spellbook is an integral part to King's Quest, and for the first part of the game, Gwydion needs to seek out several of the ingredients for these spells to help aid in escape from his magical captor. But as mentioned, the wizard is very paranoid about his young companions coming into their latent magical abilities, and if he so much catches a whiff of a spell ingredient on the player, they'll find themselves completely disintegrated. Even something as innocuous as fly wings. While under the scrutinous eye of Manannan, the player needs to make sure they have no magical contraband on their person. The game helps the player know what items are prohibited by placing an asterisk next to its name in the inventory. If the player is caught with these items, then they will be obliterated. But much like all young teenage boys in an era before the internet really took off, Gwydion has a secret stashing point under his bed to store all of his magical goods, with other illicit materials such as Dark Magician Girl Weekly and a little baggie of pixie dust. By placing all these spell items here before Manannan catches them on his person, Gwydion will keep himself safe from the wizard's fury, as long as he remembers to cover his tracks as he goes, of course. That means remembering to close the trapdoor behind him and to put the books away to where they were. And don't you ever think about forgetting to put Manannan's magical wand back in its safe, because he'll realise it's gone and immediately put two and two together, and he certainly doesn't need it to cast some particular harm on you. Fortunately, quite a number of the ingredients can already be picked up from the wizard's basement. Powdered fishbone for a spell to understand animals, saffron to fly like an eagle or a fly, nightshade juice to cause a sleeping spell, mandrake root powder to turn another person into a cat, some toad spittle for an invisibility spell, and finally, some toadstool powder to create a potion that will brew a storm for Gwydion to harness. But as you can see, we are very far from having all the ingredients for many of these spells as of yet, although Manannan's abode holds a few more goodies to pilfer, such as a vial of rose essence in his bedroom and the previously mentioned fly wings. Taking them down, Gwydion is able to follow a step-by-step guide on how to craft a flying spell. During the process, the player needs to type in exactly what to do with the ingredients, taking a pinch of saffron in the rose petal essence and reciting an incantation. O winged spirit, set me free of earthly bindings just like thee. In this essence behold the might to grant the precious gift of flight. And in the end, Gwydion needs to always wave the magic wand to complete the spell, and the amount of times where I forgot to grab the wand from the cabinet was staggering. Once you start the process, you cannot stop it, and interrupting it will result in a death screen where the player accidentally curses themselves. But with the newly powered rose petal essence, all Gwydion needs to do is dip an eagle's feather or a fly's wings in the mixture for him to take the form of the respective animals. Some of Manannan's pets also offer up some ingredients. As Gwydion roams around the solitary house, he sometimes comes across his pet cat spying on him. Now of course it never tells its owner of the little servants' boys' insubordination, But if he isn't careful, the cat can trip him up down some stairs leading down below and into yet another game over. But getting revenge is as simple as grabbing some of its cat hair, which doubles as an ingredient for the cat transformation spell. And outside, the player can snag one of the chickens and pluck one of its feathers off, acting as an ingredient for the understanding animal spell. But to find his salvation and to scavenge the rest of its ingredients, Gwydion needs to completely defy Manannan's orders for the first time in his life, and to abscond out into society, first by descending the wizard's perilous cliffs. Travelling across this rocky terrain is in itself a daunting task, especially when one considers that this is a Sierra game. I'm honestly impressed that Gwydion made it 17 years in this cruel world without falling to his death, be it plummeting down chasms like a Looney Tunes character, or by getting tripped up by Manannan's sneaky wee cat. Once again, the player needs to make use of saving, because, let's face it, they're going to need it. Outside in the wide world, things are probably just as dangerous as it would be with a grumpy wizard with death lingering at every turn. For example, if Gwydion should roam too far into the desert, he might run afoul of Medusa, who turns him to stone if he catches a glance of her or any of her snakes. Or when wandering the area, he might be set upon by some rogues who will rob him blind if he's not careful. But fortunately, some quick wit helps beguile such treacherous fates, such as knowing to carry a mirror to Uno reverse card back at Medusa and turn her into stone. And to know never to stay close to the middle of a screen where Robin Hood and his merry men might pop out and steal your things. And I mean, all of your things. Now, Sierra might have been notoriously cruel back in the day, but even they had a bit of pity for the player and lets them take a crack at snatching their stuff back. But to do so, it's pretty hidden, much like all good bandit hideouts. On the side of the desert is a tree surrounded by acorns, and it doesn't look much different from any other tree. But by reaching inside of a hole nearby, the player pulls on the rope which lowers ladders, leading into the bandits' treehouse. No Gwydions allowed though. It's pretty deviously hidden. The only means of knowing where the entrance is will be by finding two of the bandits in the local tavern and transforming into a fly, taking the saying, "Oh, to be a fly on the wall," a little too literally. Upon scaling up the tree, after several attempts, the player may find that when attempting to enter inside, there may be one of the bandits lurking inside. The player happens to enter while they're inside, the bandit will run up after them and throw Gwydion out the tree, and even though the game gives the player ample time to run outside, the bandit will still automatically yeet the small little servant boy off the ledge and down to his death. The only way to safely overcome this section is to instead peek inside the treehouse before entering. If the bandit was asleep, then it's time to enter. Otherwise, entering is certain doom for our poor protagonist. Upon sneaking inside, the player can fetch a foolishly left out bag of coins for Gwydion to snatch. Finally, the burglee becomes the burglar. And as well as this handy amount of cash to spend, the player also finds all of their lost items in a nearby bin if they were stolen. Now, the player would be forgiven for missing this area, it's pretty deviously hidden. But while you might think it will be fine to just stay safe and avoid the bandits, the reality is that the player needs these coins for much later in the game, making this area a necessary requirement. For the most part, there are not many in the way of people in this land, be they friendly or not so friendly. In the nearby port are two establishments that Gwydion can use. There's a bar where Gwydion go and have a few drinks, but this is inadvisable as it results in an unwinnable scenario later if used too much, but I'll get to that a bit later on. The most important one at present is the nearby store, where Gwydion could buy several ingredients to be used for his spellcrafting, using the gold that was so generously left for him by the bandits. Here, the player can buy some salt for the teleportation spell, an empty pouch to keep the sleep powder he'll soon craft, some fish oil to craft the cat transformation spell, and some lard to craft the invisibility ointment. And there's also a nearby dog that sheds some fur when you pet it, which comes in handy for the animal speaking spell. At this point, the player should be checking their in-game clock to make sure half an hour isn't up yet, because if they hang around for too long outside, they're going to find them on the receiving end of Manannan's punishment, and they need to give themselves enough time to complete the arduous journey of climbing back up the mountains to his house and hiding all the contraband spell items. As long as he's hidden all these items and covered his tracks, Gwydion is spared from an unfortunate demise, and the wizard returns to honk me on his bed for half an hour, leaving the player to adventure out once more. But of course, the player would still be time limited for how long they can go out. And instead, it might be better to make sure that Manannan is out of the picture for good. In fact, removing Manannan is essentially needed to progress in the game, and there is in fact a limit of how long Gwydion can remain at the wizard's house as a slave. And that's to do with the limited portion sizes that Manannan keeps in the pantry. When the player begins the game, they'll need to feed Manannan as part of their tasks. As I previously mentioned, all he has is bread, fruit and mutton, leaving only 2 more items after this. Whenever Manannan leaves the house for 25 minutes, he will come back and he'll take a nap for another 25 minutes. Upon waking, he will demand more food. This cycle will repeat twice more, where Gwydion will run out of food to give his master. Naturally, since Gwydion is forbidden from entering out in the world, you would think that the grocery shopping would fall under the wizard's task, especially since he likes to go out gallivanting in lands a lot. But no, without any food to feed his master, this becomes very much a Gwydion problem, resulting in him being killed. So it is in the young servant boy's best interest to make sure that Manannan is out of the picture as soon as possible, and the only way of doing this is by fighting magic with magic. There is one spell that is capable of doing just that, the Cat Transformation spell. The Cat Transformation is one of the important spells in the game that the player needs to craft, using 1/2 cup mandrake root powder, 1 small ball of cat hair, and 2 spoonfuls of fish oil. The player needs to mix them together and to make a cookie out of it, while reciting the following words: mandrake root and hair of cat, mix oil of fish and give a pat, a feline from the one who eats this appetizing magic treat. Finally, after waving the wand over it, it turns the cookie into a weapon that will help Gwydion finally overcome his captor once and for all. But it's not as easy as giving him the cookie, because Manannan views it as magical contraband and will kill Gwydion without hesitation. So instead, Gwydion needs to sneak it into one of Manannan's other meals, kinda like when an owner trying to feed their dog medication, but concealing it inside of any of Manannan's pantry foods is difficult, and instead the player needs to find some food in the wilds outside. To the south is a cottage, and on some occasion the player might find the occupiers leave, 3 bears, a mother and a father and a little cub. Much like many of the other King's Quest games, the player often encounters fairy tale creatures in the world, and here we've stumbled across a humble abode of the 3 bears. Although instead of a little blonde girl, the bears need to deal with a stinky and dirty servant boy intruding upon their household. Here's the funny thing though, in a world where everything's trying to kill you without any hesitation, including small little cats, one of the few things that doesn't try to even so much as maim you are these 3 bears. Instead, if any of them catch Gwydion or come across him poking his nose too close, they get defensive and toss the young man out, as any rational person would do for a hindrance such as Gwydion breaking into their home. And famously, much like the fairy tale, the 3 bears have a bit of a hankering for some porridge. Sorry bears, but it's for the greater good. With the porridge in hand, all Gwydion has to do is now crumble the cat cookie inside and wait for Manannan to rouse from his slumber and feed him his morning porridge. Contrary to popular belief, revenge isn't a dish best served hot or cold. It's a dish best served just right. With his character now being reduced to being a furry little ball of immense hatred, Gwydion is no longer time limited in going out and can safely adventure out into the wilds. At least as far as not being set upon by angry wizards. This is a Sierra game after all. I should point out that the bowl of porridge also acts as one of the game's dreaded dead ends, which means that the player has unintentionally locked them out of completing the game, because if they were to either feed Manannan the untainted porridge or eat it for themselves, they would now have no means to rid themselves of Manannan, which makes it impossible to complete the game. At least by not bugging it out. With his captor defeated, the player might wonder, what do we do now? Why, we explore of course. There are still several spells for Gwydion to craft, and he no longer needs to worry about stashing them under his bed. At this point, there are 4 more spells to create, although only 3 can be considered really important to complete the game. For the first of these spells, Gwydion just needs to grab some dried acorns at the foot of the bandit tree, although For whatever reason, the game was incredibly picky on choosing them, and I would have thought this would mean that these are not the acorns we needed. After a lot of effort, he eventually decided, yeah, these acorns will do. With them gathered and brought back, the player follows the instructions in the book to mix and grind into sleeping powder, which is safely stashed away in a pouch. The second of these spells can be found by exploring nature, where Gwydion comes across the vast ocean and uses a bowl to snag it as one of the key ingredients needed, alongside a spoonful of mud from a nearby riverbank. With the two ingredients brought back and mixed with toadstool powder, it becomes a potion capable of causing a storm, which is put inside the empty jar that once held the fish oil. The third and final of the most important spells involves Gwydion journeying out into the desert to find a cactus to cut off with a knife from the wizard's home, and with it some lard and 2 drops of toad spittle. Gwydion uses it to craft some magical ointment that turns the wearer invisible. There is a final spell to craft, although it's hidden away a bit. As Gwydion explores the world, hunting down more of the ingredients, he eventually finds a cave with a spider web, which, if he walks too close to, results in him being gobbled up fast with the banana gobbling up his morning porridge, which in hindsight wasn't very fast. And while you might think the best way of dealing with the web is to cut it down, this isn't effective, and instead the solution once again lies with magic.
Magic.
But even if this solution seems a bit convoluted, we fortunately already have most of the components we need. The fly-like an animal essence. Now, using it to turn into a fly might not be the most wisest of decisions when going up against a spider, but instead the game calls for Gwydion to take on the form of an eagle. While the fly wings were pretty easy to find, an eagle feather is more problematic because it can take an irritating amount of time before it decides to appear. In several of the screens, the player may see an eagle soaring majestically past, and if they're lucky, the eagle might see fit to part with one of its feathers as it falls to the ground for Gwydion to snag. But the problem with this is that the feather will not always appear, being a rarity in an already rare screen, meaning that there will be a lot of waiting around and aimless wandering in order to gain this key ingredient. But eventually, after a lot of boredom, an eagle should eventually drop the feather for Gwydion. Armed with the power to turn into an eagle, Gwydion uses it to snatch up the spider and yeet her into the ocean. I'm not sure if this really makes much sense, but sure, let's go with that, shall we? With the cave opened, Gwydion arrives and meets with an oracle, who reveals that they've been waiting his arrival for quite some time, which is something I'm sure we can all relate with, since we just had to wait for the arrival of a stupid bird-brained eagle for about half an hour. Previously, I mentioned that people seemed irked that they were playing a game that didn't seem to be related to the previous King's Quest entries. How could this be a King's Quest game without King Graham after all? But the plot begins to move back towards our beloved lands of Daventry, as the Oracle reveals that Gwydion is actually the estranged son of King Graham and Queen Valnice. But alas, King Graham would soon come to lose his precious son. Most likely because when Manannan showed up to pilfer children, he was like, "Hey, look behind you, a three-headed dragon," and snatched Gwydion as he was distracted. The three-headed dragon would terrorise the lands of Daventry, and to appease it, the beast demanded the sacrifice of a maiden at least once per year. Astoundingly, a heroic King Graham allowed this to happen, and for this year, Rosella, his daughter and Gwydion's sister, has been chosen. And if Graham is going to be like, oh well, about his own daughter and an undisclosed number of innocent young girls being sacrificed unto a terrible and vicious fiend, then it's up to Gwydion to sail on over to his homeland and to save the day. As he leaves, the Oracle palms off a stone, which happens to be one of several ingredients needed for the teleportation at random spell on page 7. By rubbing the stone in a mixture of salt and mistletoe and making out with it a little bit, it becomes a quick teleportation spell to help Gwydion escape from danger. At this point, some pirates will have taken anchor in the nearby village and plucked down in the watering hole. When talking with the captain, he offers to allow you passage on the ship as long as you've got the coin, which leads us into yet another potential dead end. You remember the coins we snagged from the bandits? Well, there is plenty there that will act as payment for the passage on their boat, but if the player were to spend all of it, then they would be out of luck. While at the tavern, Gwydion could keep buying rums and ales to drink, which sends him flying across the screen in a drunken haze, but as he keeps paying for them, his gold coin collection keeps dwindling until finally he's left with no more money left to pay the pirates, leaving him stranded on the lands of Lodor and leaving the game in yet another unwinnable scenario. But this in itself is very difficult to do due to his drunken staggers making it hard to reach the counter to pay in the first place. But rather than friendly pirates like Guybrush Threepwood to welcome on board, these pirates are more of the deadly variety, locking Gwydion on the ship as their prisoner and keeping them in the hold with all the stuff stolen, with no company but some nearby rats that will impart wisdom if he crafted the spell to be able to listen to animals. At this point, the player also needs to have gotten rid of Manannan, because while they might think they're safe on board the ship, sailing far from Lodor, the reality is that the wizard will find them. Looking into this, it seems that people that speedrun the game could bug this out, using a nearby crate to prevent Manannan killing them, forgoing the need for the cat cookie. But as long as the player has rid the world of the dreaded wizard and remembered to bring all of the important spells I mentioned previously, then this is exactly where the player wants to be right now, even if it looks pretty bad. On board the ship is what can be considered a stealth section, as Gwydion needs to skulk around on the lower half of the ship, using some nearby crates to scale up to a nearby ladder. Here, the player can sneak their way into the captain's quarters where they can gather all of their things, but they need to be careful in case the captain jump scares the player, running to recapture Gwydion and throw him back into the hold. And if Gwydion proves to be a very unruly passenger, then I guess the captain will have no choice but eject him from the vehicle with extreme violence. On the other side of the level is the crew's quarters, where a lone pirate guards the perimeter, blocking off in quest of Gwydion, but giving up if he leaves the area, and sometimes he just disappears completely, allowing Gwydion to pilfer a nearby shovel. At this point in the game, it's admittedly a bit strange because while it might feel like Gwydion has a lot to do on the ship, all he really needs to do is grab his stuff back from the captain's quarters, and then the player just has to twiddle their thumbs for about 15 minutes. Literally, using the game timer, you'll see that I landed on the ship at 1:26:50, and after waiting around for nearly 20 minutes, the ship arrived at its destination at 1:43:43. There is very little you can actually do during this time. Any attempt to walk on the upper deck will result in Gwydion's immediate capture and yeeting into the ocean. And while the crow's nest looks like it might be a great vantage point, attempting to scale it always results in Gwydion's untimely demise as he's thrown like Scar throws Mufasa. No, player simply has to wait. During that time they grab their stuff and the shovel if they should wish, but there is nothing else to be ventured here. Once land has been spotted, the player has to find a way to make their escape, but that involves making their way back to the deck, where many angry pirates are roaming, and it involves a little bit of witchcraft to escape safely. There are one of two spells that the player needs to ensure they crafted. The first is to make use of the sleeping powder crafted back at the wizards. By pouring the sleep powder out and uttering the magic words, "Slumber henceforth," all the pirates will fall asleep, allowing Gwydion to jump off the ship. If Gwydion were to attempt to do this before the ship nears land, then he would find himself in deep water with nowhere to go, and this might be considered another dead end. That is, unless the player has made the teleportation spell. If the player has the teleportation spell, then it will whiz them back on board the ship. Otherwise, well, at least the fish are going to get a decent meal out of him. And even if he does, then he needs to be quick, because there are some sharks near the island looking to get their teeth into some intrepid heroes that might be out too far from the relative safety of land. And the other method is to instead utilise the Eagle Feather transformation, allowing Gwydion to soar past some angry pirates and safely reach land without hassle of Bruce the Shark. Either method works, but at the end of the day, what it comes down to is the point system. Supposedly using the sleeping powder works best in terms of points gained, but it's not necessarily the safest. If anything, simply flying off avoids the hassle of the pirates on the ship, and in some guides I used to research further, I noticed they made claims that putting the pirates to sleep would mean you would not encounter them on the land either. Even in the King's Quest III hint book this suggests this, but unfortunately that's simply not the case. As I managed to stumble across a cob over here, and he managed to grab me and tell me all about Loom, assuming that I didn't manage to run off the screen in time. And sometimes he will just not show up. Speaking of points, the player can also score a higher amount of points if they go out of their way to find some hidden treasures. Back on the ship, I mentioned that the shovel was entirely optional, and that's because all it was used is to score points. The act of picking up the shovel itself awards one singular point, but it also means you'll be able to find buried treasure upon reaching the island. Now if you're a seasoned adventure game pro, or maybe just a guy who likes to dress up in pirate gear on the weekends, don't worry, I won't judge. You'll probably realise that the act of finding buried treasure is quite the ordeal without a map. But in lieu of this, there are instead wee rats on the ship. And by wee rats, I don't mean these pirates snitch. I mean literal wee rats that hang out with you in the hold of the ship. If you remember, one of the spells you can craft back at the wizard's abode is Do, to communicate with animals. And by listening in, you'll hear the rats squeal about where the pirates buried their doubloons. Aside from this, there is absolutely nothing else of importance, and instead Gwydion journeys forward, scaling up some rocks, which for some reason he's able to do now. Once again, the cliffsides are extremely dangerous for our poor Sierra protagonist, and I found myself careening off the edge that I thought was a simple bend in the road.
He's gone over that cliff!
And instead, the player needs to scale up the waterfall, taking Gwydion to the top of the mountain, which has Frost Your Tips to the 2000s boy band. But much like the future prospect of the members of said 2000s boy bands, Gwydion's about to reach a potential dead end. For up in this snowy peak, the abominable snowman makes himself comfortable, and Gwydion just so happens to be trespassing on his lands. No matter what you do in the scenario, the snowman is too fast and will catch Gwydion on foot, meaning he'll never be able to outrun them. Instead, the solution is, once again,
Magic.
there are two solutions the player can use. The first is to utilise the flying spell to take the shape of an eagle or a fly, which allows Gwydion to avoid capture, and the abominable snowman just goes, "Ah, screw this," and walks off in a huff. He doesn't get to eat Scroddy Servant Boy for dinner. The other alternative is to instead utilise the magic stone, which teleports Gwydion away before a snowman can squeeze him in his giant abominable fists. At this point, you should be okay because you'll have the rose essence regardless, because you need that to get through to the oracle to continue the game. But once past, Gwydion is now faced with scaling the mountain walls, which, much like everything else in these 80s games, is incredibly finicky and frustrating. One wrong pixel and Gwydion goes flying off the edge. I genuinely think I probably would have had an easier time trying to climb a mountain in real life compared to trying to scale one in a Sierra game. I mean, look at this nonsense. It looks like he's bounced off a bowl of jelly here. After managing to scale across the mountain walls, he now has to journey through the mountainous passageways, which was such a headache that I decided to cheese it by turning into an eagle once again to bypass it. Past the harsh mountaintops, Gwydion officially comes back to Daventry, his home, and near the castle resides an elderly gnome, old Stiltskin himself, which was the bane of pretty much every King's Quest I player, because not only did they cryptically have a puzzle where they had to guess their name, the developers actually managed to spell that name wrong, stumping a whole generation of players back in the day. Rather than torment the players further though, Stiltskin gets excited to greet the young man, revealing that Gwydion's real name is Prince Alexander, and that the fate of both his sister and the Kingdom of Daventry resides in his hands. Having given in to the dragon's demands, both King Graham and Queen Valanice have given into their despair and locked themselves in the castle away from everyone, probably hiding from all the angry parents looking for answers on why Graham let a bunch of young girls die. I mean, is it just me or does this feel kind of out of character for the noble and valiant King Graham? Indeed, Gwydion, or that is to say Alexander, can try to return back to Daventry Castle, but the place is shut down completely. Instead, all Alexander can do now is to enter the nearby caves, much like his father did many years ago to vanquish a giant. But this involves facing his family's greatest nemesis yet, stairs. Whenever I mention my issue with stairs, I do get comments providing suggestions like using the numpad, but Unfortunately, these don't seem to work for me, and instead it becomes a trial and tribulation. Like I'm an old geriatric who can't walk up the stairs, so instead I need to poop in a bucket and make the orderly clean it. So I mean, kinda like Mananan, I guess. Going back up these stairs is one of the most annoying sections in the game for me. It's incredible how old games can make this so cumbersome, to the point you need to realistically just mash the up and left keys continuously to try and manoeuvre up the stairs, taking a break midway up to wipe the sweat lashing off. And eventually Alexander reaches the top of the stairs, and his reward? A fiery death, where he'll be flambéed by the dragon if he gets too close without taking the correct precautions. What are these precautions?
Magic.
That's right, after all that huffing and puffing up the stairs, the game has saw fit to reward us with yet another potential dead end. That's so deviously placed at the final hurdle. To even get so close to the dragon, the player needs to utilise an invisibility ointment that they need to have crafted from the wizard's magic book. Without the use of invisibility, the player will never be able to reach the dragon, meaning that they have locked themselves out of winning the game. The game could have potentially been very cruel with this. In fact, the player may have been fooled into thinking they could have used the ointment elsewhere. While on board the pirate ship, the player may have struggled with trying to sneak past the very heavily armed pirates, and may have put two and two together and thought, well, what if I use the invisibility ointment? Without the ointment at this part of the game, well, Alexander is out of luck and he'll never be able to save his sister and be reunited happily with his family. What might seem to be a rare form of leniency from the game is that the game will say that the player is not able to use it as it needs to be used somewhere hot and misty. And it's probably just as well that Larry Laffer doesn't have that, because I'm sure he'd use that as an opportunity to sneak into a woman's shower room. Now Alexander has to make sure to use it in the right location, so he wouldn't be able to use it on the pirate ship. Attempting to apply the ointment elsewhere outside of that will give a message suggesting that it won't work because it's not the right location. But what might be considered an utter Richard move is that the game still applies the ointment anyway, meaning that the ointment is now out of the player's inventory and it's a dead end. But I'm sure that if you know you're about to face off against Trogdor over here, you'll have been a good little boy and made sure to save your game. The second potential dead end is now related to what deadly magic Alexander needs to have constructed in order to defeat the dragon and save the day. And that would be the only spell we've not yet spoken about, the Brewing a Storm spell. While in the wizard's study, Alexander needs to have constructed the potion and pour it into a jar to keep until the end of the game. And while under the invisibility guise, Alexander needs to get close to the dragon and follow the rest of the recipe found in their manual, by stirring the storm brew with his finger and reciting the incantation. Brew of storms, churn it up. With it, Alexander causes a deadly storm to appear on the cliffside, which you might think is a bad idea as it might hit both him and his sister. But fortunately, the only victim hit by such an onslaught is the ferocious and formidable three-headed dragon, which is struck by several bolts and completely decimated, lying dead on the floor. Alexander unties Rosella and reveals his identity as her brother, although she's like, "Sure, Jan." At this point, Rosella follows Gwydion as they make their triumphant return back home together. But there's one last dreadful foe the player must conquer, the ultimate final boss of the game. You might think, what could be more dangerous than facing off against a grumpy old wizard, a giant spider, a murderous crew of pirates, an abominable snowman, a three-headed dragon, or going up a ridiculous amount of stairs? The answer? Going down a ridiculous amount of stairs. But this time, it's even harder. Why? Because despite Alexander's successful attempts to rescue Rosella, she likes to get in his way as he's trying to manoeuvre down the extremely finicky stairs, to the point that actually resulted in me falling to my death once more. You know what they say about sibling bickering? After overcoming the obstacles, Alexander and Rosella manage to reach the gnome's home, and in his excitement, rushes off to address the king and queen of Alexander's arrival and saviour of their beloved daughter. Overjoyed, they hug their returned children as hope once more returns to Daventry, signified by the mist covering the magical mirror disappearing. The game comes to a close as King Graham fetches his adventurer's cap and flings it to his children, and the game ends before it shows who catches it. And who caught it, you might wonder? Well, you'll just have to see the next video for King's Quest IV Perils of Rosella. Gee, I wonder who it could have been. But if the game won, the family takes solace in the fact that the future looks bright. Except maybe for all the farmers and peasants who've lost their daughters because King Grail did nothing. If anything, I think they might be a bit peeved. Want to make sure you don't miss out on the video for King's Quest IV The Perils of Rosella? Then make sure you don't forget to subscribe to Noir Reservoir and click the little bell down there to be kept up to date on all future Noir Reservoir videos. And if you want to help support this channel, please consider liking it and sharing it with any adventure game aficionados you think will appreciate it. And finally, why not consider following me on Bsky? I'm sure you won't regret it. Probably. So until next time my friends, I'll catch you later.